Well, ladies and gentlemen, we might start the next session. We're now online again. So the next session, we're delighted to have with us an eminent expert, Dr. Kate Burrell. Although Ms. Single will ask you, I think, most of the questions, Dr. Burrell, could you perhaps start off by just providing your name and your qualifications and your positions, and a little bit about your CV, and then I think you'd like to make an opening statement.
We'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, and their elders past, present and emerging, and any other elders in the room today as well. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Most of my comments will be drawn from a recent paper I published, and I published that. It was self-funded research with my co-author, Shandon Harris-Hogan, but we published that on the basis, in particular, of my expertise as a clinical and forensic psychologist with over 20 years' experience. My most relevant qualification to this environment here is a PhD, in which I conducted interviews with former members of extremist and terrorist violent extremist groups, particularly in relation to their disengagement, how and why they left violent extremism, and what happened after that, and then reverse engineered that to have a look at what were the elements that went into a person being able to disengage and move away from violent extremism, what we can learn about that for prevention and intervention as well. I also, as a clinical and forensic psychologist, have qualifications at a master's level in that area. I have some irrelevant qualifications in commerce as well, which aren't very helpful here today. And probably the other relevant aspect, apart from practicing and working with young people for a long period of time, is I'm the co-founder and the chief impact officer of an organisation called Street in Melbourne, and I'll just briefly talk about that because it is relevant to intervention and support programs. We work with young people, 16 to 24 years of age. They're from all sorts of backgrounds. About 40% of our young people have had contact with the criminal justice system before they come to us. Some of them have homelessness issues. Many of them have drug and alcohol issues or mental health issues. Most of them have 3 or 4 or 5 of these types of issues. So they're very high needs, complex young people. And we run a series of programs, vocational training programs in hospitality, as it turns out, where we wrap an individual program around them of support with a worker. They're in a larger group program that provides them with new peers who are all very different backgrounds, but all at a point where they're ready to sort of do something different in their life. We facilitate a group program with that, and then they do on-the-job work training as well for about 6 months. And we find that an incredibly valuable process, and they make some incredible gains with that. So I'll draw a little bit on that experience as well today.
And Dr. Burrell, I'm not sure if you mentioned that you gave expert evidence at the Lint Cafe Coronial. You were called by counsel assisting, I think, in that matter?
I did. I didn't mention that. I'm sorry. That's correct, yes.
All right. Yes, please go on.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe just for about 10 or 15 minutes I might talk through the paper that appears to be relevant today, particularly for people who haven't had a chance to read it. And it is paywall block, which is a very frustrating feature of academic journals. I think there's a copy up at the back. I'm extremely happy to share it in the other papers with people who are interested as well.
Thank you.
This particular research that I did with Mr. Harris-Hogan, it's titled Young Blood, Understanding the Emergence of a New Cohort of Australian Jihadists. Excuse me. Whereas most of the work that he and I have done together with various models of radicalisation and of disengagement, we focus in the broader work on all forms of violent extremism. So right-wing, left-wing, ethno-nationalist and jihadist. This particular paper looked just at examples of jihadist violence in Australia for the last 17 years. So it's a slightly narrower slice than what we usually look at. The particular time period for this research was 2000 to the end of 2016. And it was open source, so court documents, police statements. We tried to take most credible information that was available at the time. I should point out that some new information and court transcripts have become available since the publishing, excuse me, since the publishing of this paper. So there may be some case studies and examples discussed today that would have been dealt with slightly differently in this paper based on the information we had at the time. Overall, what we found in the 17-year period studied was that the Australian jihadist network has had 3 broad waves. And I'll talk quickly about the first 2 and then zero in on the third, which is most relevant, I think, to your inquiry here. The first wave, from 2000 to 2004, there were 7 people arrested on terrorism or terrorism-related charges or who perpetrated terrorist acts of violence in Australia. They were predominantly linked to Jemaah Ismailiyah, JI. All of the people arrested were male. And relevant for our conversation today, the average age of those men was 31.4. Okay. If we move to the second wave, from 2005 to June 2014, there were 37 people arrested on terrorism-related charges. They were, again, all male. Most of the people there were involved in Operation Pendennis and Operation Neath. So that was about 27 people, and then there were 10 other individuals as well. And the average age of those men, and they were all male in that period, had dropped from 31.4 in the first wave to 27.5. So a slight lowering, but not a major difference. No teenagers in either of those waves. The third wave, which we marked from July 2014, which is when IS or ISIL declared the new caliphate, so that marked the beginning of that third wave, through until December 2016. There were a total of 72 individuals arrested.
Just pausing there, we understand, but not everyone might understand the call to jihad by al-Baghdadi and the reference to Australia. Could you just say something about that?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the very big differences was that, and this taps into some of the discussion around internet and social media as well, ISIL have been extremely good at drawing on young people and teenagers. They've had teenagers in very important positions of authority, and there was a statement, a call to arms by al-Baghdadi, which called specifically on individuals to do what they could in their homelands and to grab ordinary weapons like knives or vehicles and so on. And it was very, very soon after that the first event happened.
And Australia was specifically mentioned?
And Australia was specifically mentioned, that's right, yes. Yes, that's right. In that period, there were many terrible events took place. 3 perpetrators were killed across several of those incidents. 34 people were arrested. 18 plots that we were able to count in the open media, 14 of which were interrupted by police, and I think that was mentioned in some of the comments this morning. There were some other arrest warrants issued as well for 38 people, which brought it to the total of 72 individuals. We had the first fatal acts of jihadist violence on Australian soil in that period. So the Lindt Cafe siege in December 2015, notably. We had the October 2015 shooting of the police accountant Curtis Cheng, and moving backwards we had in September 2014 Abdul Newman Haider, who was shot dead whilst attacking 2 members of the Victorian Joint Counter-Terrorism Team in Victoria as well. Interestingly, in that period, we had the first females arrested, a very small number, 3, but that had not occurred before then. And in particular, one of the most striking differences of this phase was that there were 24 teenagers arrested in there, to our count. This represented an 850% increase over the first 2 waves altogether, so it was a significant uplift in activity. And very rough maths, but it went from roughly 1 arrest per year in the sort of first and second wave through to about 1 arrest per month if you were to average it out across. Previously, there were a small number of big spectacular plots involving coordinated and large numbers of people with the intention of killing large numbers. In the third wave, we saw fewer people involved in each activity. It was inspired rather than directed or coordinated, and generally smaller plots with smaller casualties in terms of numbers. the most striking feature of the third wave is, of course, that the age of those who were involved became younger. So we now had teenagers as a reasonably distinct subgroup kicking out there. Prior to mid-2014, if we roll the first two waves together, the youngest person we had arrested was in their 20s, the average age was late 20s, most were in their 20s and 30s. Since 2014, which correlated with the announcement of the caliphate and subsequent directives as well, we had 33% of the individuals arrested on terrorism-related charges were teenagers. I am aware that the way we did our paper was looking at teenagers in particular, and that you make a distinction here between children and young people up to 25. So those up to 25 haven't been counted in this particular analysis. With the figures I'm giving you, it would increase because there are a number of others.
So you include people up to 19?
That's right. Yep. One of the other things that I think is worth saying, I've outlined some of the differences, but some of the things that stayed the same across the three waves were that people who became radicalised, by and large, did so through links with family or social groups. Okay, and there's a big conversation to be had about what the role of internet and social media is. However, across the board, we had 86%, and I'll double check that in a minute, but I think it was 86% of all of the individuals who were arrested, we were able to find a real-world connection to someone else in the network. That doesn't mean social media and internet didn't play a role, and it certainly is far more prevalent for the teenagers and in the third wave. But it would be very difficult to argue that social media and internet causes radicalisation alone. And in fact, it's very difficult to find examples of individuals who have no real-world contact, though they do exist, but they're less than 10% of the case. So it's certainly not the norm that that's exclusively the way somebody radicalises. Here we go. Out of the 116 people in our full study, only 9 of them across that carried out acts of violence alone. So this goes to a fairly subtle distinction between, and it's a language, a terminology thing. The term lone actor is used in slightly different ways by slightly different people. Okay, so maybe it's helpful to think about whether a person radicalises alone or in a group, and then equally to think about whether a person acts alone or in a group. Okay, and that they're not necessarily overlapping, though most people radicalise in a group. If you radicalise in a group, you can go on and act alone, and we've seen some examples of that. If you radicalise alone, then it would be a very odd thing for you to go and act in a group, so that's generally a blank cell, but certainly you could radicalise alone and then act alone as well. And that's when the experts go down into this field, they use terminology that is solo actor is someone who radicalises in a group and then acts alone, and then a true lone actor is someone who radicalises alone and acts alone. And I won't spend too much time on it, but because it's usually raised, the role of mental health in this applies most specifically to people who radicalise alone and act alone. And one of the experts in that area, Paul Gill, talked about mental health, and there's 3 particular diagnoses that turn out to be more prevalent in that group than the normal population, and than group actors. But it still only affects about 1/3 of lone actors in that group. So in his words, it's mental health is a cause of a cause amongst a slice of people. So I'm happy to take questions on that later, but I will talk about the majority, which is people who generally don't have diagnosed mental health issues and who are acting in a group, or radicalising in a group and perhaps acting alone occasionally. One of the other things that stayed consistent across all 3 waves, and is absolutely present in the third wave, is the critical role of identity and belonging. And again, in one of the opening statements this morning, we heard some very sensible commentary about the critical role of identity and belonging in extremist groups. And what I found from all the broader research that I've done is that most people who join extremist groups, violent extremist groups, do so for personal and social reasons. Many of them adopt the ideology almost like a membership fee afterwards. It's about being with the people and having your personal and social needs met. And often the group then becomes greedy and it becomes the dominant identity group. You pull away from other groups, and you may not have been able to get your needs met through those other groups to start with. So being a part of this group here is predominantly meeting your needs. It may not be good for your mental health, but it's better than having no friends and no belonging and nowhere. So coming at it from a psychological perspective, it meets needs. And that takes us to a useful thing to think about for disengagement, which is how can we meet a person's needs in other ways so they don't have to hurt themselves or somebody else as well. A couple of quick points that I will make on leaving violent extremist groups. What many people who don't study in this area don't realise is that most people who join extremist groups actually leave. The majority of people who join leave, and most people who leave voluntarily without any formal assistance. Disillusionment is the main reason they lose commitment, and it's usually social disillusionment. They get disillusioned either with the leadership or with the group members around them. There are other reasons, but they're the two predominant ones.
So, Dr. Burrell, you're talking there, though, about the experience in Australia. What we know, I think, from ISIL in the Middle East is leaving is not an option.
That's right.
Quite often.
Yeah.
So that's quite different.
It is. However, from the limited number of studies that I've read from people who have done who have left ISIL and been interviewed, they talk about the disillusionment as well. So it is much harder to leave. That's right, and the consequences are way higher.
The first thing you are required to do, I think, is to hand over your passport.
That's right. Yeah. Physically, it's very difficult to leave, but that doesn't stop you from wanting to leave or being psychologically disengaged from it. That's right. Yes. Even in environments where it's not as sort of difficult to physically leave, it can often take people 1 to 2 years to be able to do so in a safe way and in a way they feel they've got the support to step out. So even if there are no threats or physical barriers to your leaving, it can be an extremely difficult thing for a person to do. So my point there is that it requires a lot of support to help. If we want to facilitate or accelerate a disengagement process and help somebody leave, it makes good sense to support the natural process and to assist them there. It's also interesting to know, back in the Australian context, that we talk about pull factors and push factors. So pull factors being things that you would like to do once you leave, you're pulled towards them. Push factors, the things you're not enjoying anymore. Slight subtle distinction, pull factors such as jobs and relationships, not wanting to have such a difficult life anymore, tend to come online after a person is disillusioned. So once the magic is broken a little bit, then those other things become much more relevant. Probably the headline statement around disengagement from violent extremism is that the key to disengagement is about meaningful engagement somewhere else. Okay? And when I sort of deconstructed so many stories of disengagement, what I found was that there were 5 main areas that a person needed to address in their life in order to move on from violent extremism. And this will be relevant for interventions later on. Very briefly, those 5 areas: social relations, essentially the way you interact with the world, the in-group, the out-group, who's evil, who's good, who's acceptable, who you can interact with, needs to shift in order for you to move on. And that there was a parallel process for that coming into the group as well. Coping is another area that's critical if we're going to assist a person leaving. And that's everything from clinical support if it's required, counselling, health issues, education, training, sustainable livelihood, a person's ability to cope. And of course, most of the way human beings get their coping needs met is socially. We do it through the people around us. And if you've been a part of a group and then leave that group, you often need other people, but if you're not prepared to talk with other people, it's difficult to have those needs met. Identity is the third area, and that's the million-dollar question of adolescence and young adulthood anyway. It's a very important process to go through. In terms of somebody coming outside of a group, who am I if I'm not a part of that group anymore? And if I haven't had a strong sense of self going into it, then I've got a fairly large process to go through when I come out of it, and I may or may not be given support for that. There is the fourth category is called action orientation, and that's really around how do I deal with injustice in non-violent ways. Okay? And then the fourth one is about ideology and belief. And we put ideology and beliefs last because in all of the people that I've done interviews with and studied who have successfully left violent extremist groups, not all of them have changed their mind. Okay? And this is a fairly reliable finding across internationally and across all different types of extremist groups, is that roughly 30% of people who disengage, walk away from an extremist group, don't use violence again, do not change their minds. And I had one man sit and tell me about 4 or 5 times that he had not changed his beliefs. He was absolutely adamant about that, but it's a fairly robust finding. And my point there is that, while it's not always uncomfortable, it's not always comfortable to hear, we know that a person can change their behaviour without changing their beliefs. And that goes to an important distinction in intervention programs, which is the distinction between disengagement and de-radicalisation.
Yes, quite.
Very, very briefly, disengagement is the behavioural change of not using violence, de-radicalisation being a much bigger package that includes not just my behaviour, but my views, my beliefs, my attitudes, my identity as well. And when people refer to disengagement programs or de-radicalisation programs, they're actually quite different beasts if they're using the terms correctly. And a de-radicalisation program is an extremely difficult thing to do. As a psychologist who's worked in the forensic sector for over 20 years, and I'm reasonably good at what I do, but I've never been able to make someone change their mind if they haven't wanted to be a part of that process.
I mean, it may be the work of a lifetime.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and what we know from lots of case studies is that it's not necessary to change your mind to change your behaviour, and I understand that leaves an uncomfortable sense of risk and perhaps not being able to mitigate risk down to zero for people who are holding that risk, but it's an important distinction, I think. Back to the paper, I think one other quick thing to say about lone actors is that whilst we're looking at about, in the paper with the numbers here, in the third wave alone, 80% of those who were arrested were acting as a part of a group, which left 20%. If you go into that 20%, only a smaller proportion of them were arrested because they were planning to or they perpetrated acts of violence. So an even smaller number, it was actually only 7% of the entire sample acted alone without any apparent real-world human connection. So we weren't able to find any connection there. Just a quick note on methodology. This was a paper where we looked mostly at numbers and cases. We didn't go down into deep detail because mostly the detail wasn't available to us. So when I say people radicalised in a group or with other connections, what it meant was we were able to find reporting of a connection out there. And if we weren't able to find that, then we put it into the bucket of saying that we didn't find any evident real-world connection. So possibly that's an underestimate in itself as well, because that might reveal itself in time. Interestingly, though, the distribution of lone actors since 2000, the vast majority of them have occurred in the last wave. So not only are there more teenagers, and we're talking 7 out of 8, so they're tiny numbers, and roughly out of 116 people, if we fudge the math, it roughly corresponds to less than 10% of them as well. So it still is a minority, but it's a significant increase on 0% from before. I'm not sure whether you'd like me to, perhaps I'll seek your guidance on this, whether you would find it helpful or interesting for a couple of comments on young brains, on the neurology of development and so on, and how that might lend itself to radicalisation. So most people know intuitively that adolescence is a neurological period of development that takes some time. That actually extends, brain maturation takes until mid-20s for females and late 20s for males on average, and obviously there are individual differences there. In legal and social understandings, we sort of draw a line at 18, and then sometimes we talk about young people at 21 or 25, and there's various definitions for that. Sometimes we take the low age down to 12. More commonly, it's 15 or 16 for young people. Most youth programs in the community work with sort of starting with 14 or 15-year-olds up to mid-20s. Is not uncommon at all. What we do know about that period is that identity development is absolutely crucial, and it's not just a buzzword. People are defining themselves. They often define themselves in contrast to authority figures, but in particular to people, that role models that they have already. So this is where the notion of rebelling against your parents and authority come from. That's a very normal thing to do, even if you have a very healthy and positive relationship with your parents. So it becomes much more complicated if they're complicated family relationships as well. It's also absolutely normal for young people to be totally preoccupied with a whole range of things, and these things don't always sit together easily. So it's about love and affection and needing to be accepted, particularly when you're feeling vulnerable and awkward, wanting to be free, wanting power, wanting understanding, wanting certainty. It's a period of time where positive groups and toxic groups facilitate, enhance, support and take advantage of this. So many of the same dynamics that go on in extremist groups for young people occur in a positive way in sporting groups, in a negative way with gangs and other violent groups, crime groups, for example, cults, very, very similar social dynamics that go on there. And interestingly, some similar themes that come out when a person tries to leave one of those toxic groups as well. But the other thing that is, again, helpful just to remind us about with young people and the neurological development is there's two things that go on with the brain and with emotions in particular. One is the frontal and the prefrontal cortex is not well developed, and that speaks to emotional control and emotional regulation. And we joke about, and we know, everyone knows teenagers who go through that emotional up and down, not just to do with hormones, but to do with controlling their very intense emotions. There's some research that's come out to show that young people are predisposed towards intense negative reactions. So if they have a negative experience, then it's very, very intensely experienced for them. And if we start to pair this with the absence of protective factors, if they don't have strong or supportive relationships around them, then that can make a person particularly vulnerable. And this is the case for all teenagers, not just those getting tangled up in toxic groups, but that makes it particularly vulnerable for them. The other thing that goes on is around risk decision making. So there's two elements to that. When you take a young brain and you place some risk decisions in front of it, the younger brain can usually see roughly the same amount of risk or danger as a mature brain can. Where the difference is in the payoff. Okay, so a young brain will see way more payoff in a situation than a mature brain will. And there's like MRI studies to support this. So what it means is that additionally, if you put young brains in the presence of other young brains, such as peers, again, we know intuitively that they make riskier decisions. Risk goes up when you make risk decisions with your friends, more so than when you are alone as a teenager. This, I think, has implications for and goes some way towards explaining the intersection with social media, because if I'm a digital native, which I'm not, but if I was, and I'm on my phone 24/7, I don't make a distinction between my online and my offline friends. They're with me 24/7. So if I'm making a decision even on my own, but if I'm portraying that through social media or getting feedback through social media for it, then my decisions will be riskier. And that's the case for all young people. And we know that the use of internet and social media is pervasive. There's, I think, less than 2% of people between 13 and 33 who don't have some social media platform or regular access to the internet.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Dr. Burrell, in terms of your methodology, I don't think you've actually addressed this yet. You identified 116 jihadists until the end of 2016. That's
right, yes.
If I can just confirm that this was the framework by which you identified those 116, the requirement for your study was that an individual had conducted an illicit activity motivated by jihadist ideology, which resulted in an Australian warrant being issued for their arrest, that it included jihadists who had been killed perpetrating an act of terrorism in Australia, and that foreign fighters were only included if an Australian warrant had been issued and you had come to know about that Australian warrant.
That's right. We were very focused on the domestic situation, yes.
So it could be that there is actually more than 116 jihadists, but that was the criteria by which you operated for your paper.
That's right, yes.
Just dealing very briefly with the idea of lone actors, because I appreciate that they're a very small cohort of the review, and as a result, research is limited. Have you seen any distinction with lone actors as per the age of such individuals?
There is no research that I'm aware of that specifically looks at that. Ours didn't specifically, but a distinct observation is that in the third wave, the vast majority of the lone actors occurred. So I think it was 8 out of the 9, I said, and that 7 out of 8 of those were teenagers. Is that right? 7 out of the 8 were in 2014, and find the number in front of me. I think it was 5 out of the 7 were teenagers, yes.
And do you see a correlation there with the influence of the internet, so that there isn't a physical human influencer? Is it the case that there's likely to be an online human influencer in those cases?
Look, that's kind of a million-dollar question, and I'm not trying to be evasive, but it's very difficult to answer because over 90% of teenagers have access to the internet. So very hard to certainly can't make any causal statements around that. Even hard to make correlational statements with such tiny numbers going on to use it. However, to the extent that you're able to dive into each of the cases, I think it's absolutely fair to say that it plays a role. And it can play a very important role. In some cases, it almost substitutes for real-world relationships, and that kind of goes down that area of if a person has mental health issues and they can't do relationships quite so well, they might substitute in there. It's easy to forget that the internet and social media in particular, it actually provides community as well. And so it's not an alternative to real life relationships for young people. It's very much a parallel adjunct for them. So I'm very uncomfortable talking about it as any kind of causal or correlational thing, but it's absolutely in the mix. Absolutely in the mix.
And you note the importance of social relationships in terms of a radicalisation of an individual. What type of social relationships are you seeing? Are familial or peer relationships, or an outside influence who has come in to target individuals?
No, that's a very good question. So what we found there, and let me just find the actual figures for you. Here we go. So again, just a little bit on methodology. Of the 24 individuals, teenagers, we only had sufficient information publicly available to make to draw a conclusion regarding their immediate social network for 21 of them. So we excluded 3 simply because we didn't have enough information. Of those 21, 19% had a family connection to another individual in the network, and then 67% had a peer connection. So it was very clearly those two, and that tracks with international research, which roughly sits at 20% and 70% for the same influence there. And just one other very quick comment to double back and tie it in with just to go back to social media. Our comment around not being able to find many cases where there was no family connection and no real world connection, and yet a strong internet or social media connection tracks against the research in that area, which states very, very strongly, and this is fairly robust research, certainly not my own, but we lent on it in the paper to say that our finding of a predominant real-world connection for most cases reflected the international research around social media and the role of it, insofar as it doesn't cause it, is what the main literature says. So.
In terms of the use of internet and social media, we've seen the rise by ISIL of their own social media arm. And, for example, they do their own video production company.
Yes.
Are you seeing, if it is at all possible to say, whether or not you're seeing peer cohorts essentially sharing social media, whether it be sharing of videos or propaganda.
Absolutely, but this is what people do. This is what young people do anyway. But they're absolutely doing it with this, and ISIL have been had no hesitation in recruiting, training, deploying young people, and then broadcasting that as overtly as they can. They put young people in as security emirs. They feature them in the propaganda, and then other young people take that and share it with each other as well. Yes.
I mean, a term used in some of the literature is that jihadi content is disseminated by means of a swarm cast, an interconnected network that constantly reconfigures itself, much like a swarm of bees. It's defined by speed, agility and resilience, and has allowed ISIS and their sympathisers to outmanoeuvre all efforts to date to significantly reduce their online presence.
Yeah, they're extraordinarily successful and skilled at using that. That's right, and it's speaking the language. It's the language of young people who have been raised as digital natives.
And of course, some of that's in English. It's not all in Arabic.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Looking at the social connection between jihadists and other individuals within the network, we heard in this morning's session a reference to there being a multi-generational risk relating to terrorist offenders. I'd now like to try and explore, if I can, the chances of rehabilitation, whether that be disengagement primarily and de-radicalisation. How do you see the role of the family and peer relationships in terms of disengaging an individual? First of all, on more general, how important is the role of family and peer relationships in disengaging? And if I can ask you the second part of it, what problems do you think arise when it is a multi-generational risk of terrorist offencing, such that a child or young offender cannot turn to their family network for support in disengagement?
No, there's no doubt it becomes very complex in the second scenario, and it's hard enough in the first scenario. So the role of family and peers really goes to that first of those 5 areas that I spoke about, social relations. And if you are moving away from a group, what you need to do, I mean, it's one thing for us to ban somebody from spending time with another person, and we know that, if we say that to a teenager under ordinary circumstances, the first thing that we'll do is get pushback from you. So the much more challenging and important task is how to provide opportunities or encourage people to develop new friendships, new relationships with positive people who are going to help them and have their best interests at heart. Families hopefully can play that role, and in many, many cases, we've seen many, many examples where that has been the case. People might get involved via a family member into a group, but they'll disengage and pull away and gain support from different family members. So I guess the first point is that families aren't homogenous, and it's rare to have nobody in the extended network who's willing to provide support or step up. Similarly with peers, the longer a friendship has gone on, and in some of the research around this, is the childhood friendships that then draw people in later on are ones that they've had for 10, 15 years. So it's hard to magic up new friendships for young people, but friends are easier to find than family. So difficult to do a wholesale relocation because that's very hard on a young person, but that's feasible as an extreme option. Going to the more difficult scenario where you might have several generations in a family involved in this, then obviously it becomes more and more difficult. A parallel, if you like, just into our program at Street, we have some young people, and I'll use a parallel that's not to do with crime, but we have some young people who have nobody in their family who's ever worked before. And so it's very difficult to find a role model who can demonstrate those behaviours. In some cases, we'll draw an extended family for that. In other cases, it simply doesn't exist, and we need to provide it in a professional sense. So we'll draw on youth workers or social workers, or go and find other programs where there are either older role models or peers who are pointed in a pro-social direction, but in an area that's interesting to the young person as well. But I do totally acknowledge how difficult it is to do that. But I don't think we can say it's impossible. I don't think we can give up on it. I think we have to find relationships for young people, because the heart of radicalisation and the heart of disengagement is about social relations. So,
now, I know in the case of MHK, and we'll hear more about that this afternoon, the importance of the role of community leaders in rehabilitation of that young man. What do you see as the role of community leaders in trying to break the human influencer that these young people are encountering?
It's potentially very, very powerful, is their role. It comes back to the quality of the relationship. It comes back to how early that relationship can be in place. We talk about early intervention when someone has contact with police. In my professional psychological view, that's not early intervention. Early intervention is back when somebody is 10 or 12 and things start to go a little bit off track. But it's never too late to have an intervention. And an intervention that comes before being arrested or prison is obviously a good one there. In terms of relationships with, say, community leaders, one point to bear in mind is that the further down a radicalisation pathway a person is, and particularly a young person, the less likely they are to accept the guidance or authority of a traditional authority figure who the community leader might well be. So the key to that relationship is finding someone who's credible in the eyes of the young person. And that goes to all of the very thoughtful consideration that needs to go into tailoring an intervention for an individual rather than an off-the-shelf kind of thing. But the role of community leaders can be very important, and it might be a slow burn thing. It might be something that takes a little while to build up and develop over time. So persistence and trust is required as well.
For the case where early intervention has not worked or a child has not been identified as needing early intervention, so that they have then found themselves within the correctional or juvenile justice facilities, what implications do you see for the management of those young people might flow from your view of the importance of social relationships for the de-radicalisation programs?
Yeah, look, and I know I was reading somewhere about the recidivism rate within a very small group of young people and reoffending, and of course that's going to put them into custodial situations sooner or later, and of course that then makes it extremely difficult to provide alternate social relationships. Ultimately, most humans, but particularly teenagers, take their views, often their beliefs, certainly their behavioural guidance from the people around them. Okay? And we know this for all sorts of things, not even, well beyond violence, but to do with sport, to do with health, to do with what you eat, and certainly for antisocial things as well. So the critical question is, to what extent in a very constrained environment can you provide alternate, positive social relationships for young people? And it might be around, and again, this is assuming that there aren't the structural problems and issues that there are in a custodial setting. I fully appreciate how complex that is. But the theoretical ideal would be to take a young person who we're trying to assist to disengage and place them with some other young people who don't have any radicalisation background whatsoever. So it's a fresh group of friends. They might have had other issues in their past, but a little like the young people that we see at Street. They're a group of young people with a very diverse background, but the thing in common is that they're pointed in a new direction. So that's sort of like a dilution model that goes against housing all the radicalised young people together, because you're much more likely to become more so if you're surrounded by people similar to you like that. There are some other possibilities, particularly within the juvenile justice system, for example, schooling options and so on, so where you can facilitate either therapeutic or educational or vocational relationships with mentors, teachers, that kind of thing, that can be incredibly valuable. I've seen that work very well.
You also mentioned the importance of meaningful engagement somewhere else in terms of helping disengagement. To the extent you can, are you able to say how this could be done within a correctional centre or juvenile justice environment?
Look, it is always harder when you've got those restraints there, but that could be something like study. It could be sport. It could be some self-directed learning. it could even be friendships with other people, but it comes back to the principle of stick over carrot, and a person will control their behaviour if they have to when somebody is watching, but they're much more likely to change their behaviour genuinely if it's related to something they're motivated to do. So the challenge is to find what's motivating to that young person. The options are far less in a custodial setting, but I do believe they exist. It just comes down to really quite sophisticated case management and dedication from workers to find that thing, talk to the person, form a relationship, and understand what it is from their perspective.
What is your view on Australians' efforts to engage youth in the countering violent extremism programs which are currently in place?
Yeah, look, there are some excellent community-based programs that I'm aware of in the States. They vary enormously. I think a lot of the community-based programs come under the umbrella of building community resilience and social cohesion, and sometimes that's funded or tagged under a CVE umbrella, which causes other issues in itself. But there are some excellent programs out there for that. And if we think about the sort of public health model of prevention, so it's that pyramid model where at the bottom you have primary prevention, which are programs that are available to lots of people and good for everybody, but essentially set up a set of conditions under which the thing you don't want to happen is less likely to happen. And then the next level up is tailored specific programs for identified individuals who are showing signs of whatever the thing is, in this case radicalisation. And then the real pointy end with where there's much fewer individuals is where you're doing responses to after the event. So I think the biggest power is in the prevention, but the trouble there is that it's so hard to know what it is that's going to prevent an individual from going down their particular pathway. I think there's really good room for us to develop and mature the programs that we have in Australia around the individual interventions, and there's the formal interventions that were mentioned this morning, the Living Safe Together program, which are I think funded by the Commonwealth and run through the states, and they again vary from state to state, but my understanding of them is that they're individually tailored for each case, and that's very important. There's a set of tools that go with that as well, which provides consistency across the states and within cases. That's very good. My understanding, however, is that there are no youth-specific programs or youth-specific tools. And this is, I think, not so much an oversight or it's simply when the tools were developed and when the programs were developed, there wasn't the 30%, 33% of teenagers involved. So the programs were developed evidence-based with some young people in the mix, but without a focus on adolescents and young people and without, I think, proper attention to the developmental issues that they need. So I think that perhaps the time is right for us to review, validate, and perhaps develop some youth-specific tools and programs, because I think we're adapting the adult ones at the moment, and we don't know that that's the proper thing to do.
You refer to the absence of violent extremism risk assessment tools specifically designed for youth in your article, and you've referred to tools again just now. Can you just explain in a bit more detail what a risk assessment tool is and why it is so important for the disengagement process and for intervention for us to have those types of tools?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I refer to tools, risk assessment's one part of it, but any intervention requires an assessment up front, and a holistic assessment about pretty much everything that is relevant to that young person, including the risk factors for, in this case, violent extremism. It's really important that any set of tools is as evidence-based as possible. I should say in this area it's not contentious, but it's early. It's early in the field. There's a number of tools that exist internationally around this. We are now just up to the process of starting to compare, contrast and validate those tools against each other. So it's very early in the development of this. To my knowledge, there's not a set of those tools specific for teenagers or adolescents worldwide. It may be worked on and I just may not be aware of it. But yeah, to my knowledge, it doesn't exist. But the risk assessment part up front is obviously helpful for law enforcement, but it's only a tiny part of the assessment that's necessary to develop a plan for young people. So the whole point of an assessment is to then be able to develop an informed case management plan and intervention for the young person. And then the tools would go on and also help you map the progress and assess change in behaviour against the person's baseline, because there is no scale that you can then draw against, so it has to be referenced back to the individual, and that's quite an involved process, and that's why I think we need very much to pause and have a look at what the developmental needs of young people are, because they're quite different to adults.
Mr. Trent?
You might have heard Dr. Burrell. I'll be asking on a slightly different topic.
Sure.
You might have heard this morning the Attorney General's Department suggesting that Section 19 AG, which requires a sentencing court to impose a non-parole period of 3/4 of the head sentence, they suggested that might have some empirical justification on the basis that it takes a long time for a person to de-radicalise or disengage. I was wondering if you had any comment or were aware of any evidence to support this 3/4 rule, given your expertise and experience in disengagement and de-radicalisation.
I don't know of anything in relation to the 3/4 rule. What I do know is that it can take time for a person to disengage and or de-radicalise, with or without assistance, years, certainly. Probably the most important thing in that process is the environment, the context in which it happens, and that comes back to the social relations. It's the ability, in a real-world kind of way, excuse me, to be able to form, develop, exercise, practice, and bed down, being able to interact and relate with different people, which then, of course, forms part of your views of the world and your views of them as well. So no, I don't know of any evidence around the 3/4 rule, but extrapolating, I would, as we've already discussed, it's very, very difficult to do that process in a constrained environment like a prison. And I understand that sometimes young people need to be in prison, sometimes that's the risk and that's necessary, but as a therapeutic environment designed to help young people rehabilitate and disengage, it's not a therapeutic environment.
Just one more question from us. You've talked a little bit about women and girls as opposed to boys and young men. My understanding with ISIL, for example, in the Middle East, is that boys start military training from about 9. Girls don't do that sort of military training, but on the other hand, it's become increasingly apparent that they are given specific roles in ISIL, which further ISIL's mandate. Looking here in Australia, does your research tell us anything about the different roles foreseen for boys and girls, young men and young women?
The short answer is no.
Right.
It doesn't, because the numbers are far too small. No. I could extrapolate, but I think I'd be.
Thank you very much.
Strange.
Well, Dr. Burrell, we're deeply grateful for your expertise and for coming up here to join us. We thank you very much, and we'll now pause until 1:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.